Plato didn't fear pleasure because it felt good. He feared it because it felt too good, and because men, once consumed by it, stopped seeking anything higher. He saw pleasure not as evil, but as dangerous. It doesn't kill the body. It starves the soul. When you give in to momentary indulgence again and again, you're not just wasting time, you're reshaping your identity. You become smaller, duller. Your will weakens. And soon you no longer desire truth, wisdom, or greatness. You just want the next hit. Porn, fast food, TikTok, dopamine on demand. And worst of all, you still think you're in control. Plato would say you've already surrendered, not to a master, but to your own appetite. In his most haunting allegories, Plato describes the soul as a chariot pulled by two opposing horses. One horse is noble, white, disciplined. It seeks truth, virtue, elevation. The other is black, wild, impulsive. It chases pleasure, comfort, escape. And the charioteer, your reason, is meant to guide them. But in the addicted man, that charioteer is asleep, or worse, broken. The black horse drags the entire soul downward, chasing fleeting highs while the higher path fades from view. You begin to justify what you once resisted. You call weakness self-love. You call indulgence freedom. And soon, you forget you were ever meant to rise. That's the danger. Not just the act of pleasure, but the slow erosion of the part of you that once longed for more. Plato wasn't a preacher. He was a map maker of the soul. He didn't use guilt or moral panic to steer men away from pleasure. He simply pointed to what it does to the architecture of the mind. When you surrender to constant stimulation, your attention fragments. Your thoughts become shallow. You lose the ability to sit in silence, to wrestle with your own questions. And without that inner dialogue, the soul withers. You become what he called a man of appetite, governed not by truth or principle, but by whatever feels good now. You might still speak of purpose, goals, discipline, but underneath, your will is hollow. And Plato would ask, how can a man who cannot govern his own desires claim the right to govern anything at all? To Plato, true freedom was never the ability to indulge. It was the ability to choose not to. He believed that the soul, when ruled by reason, climbs upward, toward beauty, truth, the eternal. But when ruled by appetite, it spirals downward, into chaos, addiction, and self-deception. He called this tyranny of the self, a state where the lower parts of your nature overthrow the higher. It starts with pleasure but ends with slavery, not to another person, but to your own compulsions. You no longer eat because you're hungry. You eat to escape. You no longer watch porn because you're aroused. You do it because you can't sit with yourself in silence. That is not freedom. That is what Plato called spiritual decay. Plato understood that addiction isn't just a chemical problem. It's a philosophical collapse. It's when the soul forgets what it is. When the higher part of you, the one built to create, to reason, to lead, gets hijacked by the lower. And what makes it worse is that the lower doesn't shout. It whispers. It tells you you deserve it, that it's harmless, that everyone does it. And so, like the prisoners in the cave, you start to confuse the shadows for reality. You think a pixel on a screen is intimacy. You think scrolling endlessly is rest. But deep down, something in you knows. This isn't nourishment, it's seduction. And the longer you stay, the more your soul forgets the taste of real food. In the Republic, Plato describes the soul of the tyrant. Not a man who rules others, but a man who cannot rule himself. His life is filled with chaos. He is ruled by passions. Every desire becomes urgent. Every moment is lived in reaction. And yet, this tyrant thinks he is free. He lives for pleasure, but pleasure to Plato is never neutral. It either serves the soul, or it destroys it. And when it becomes your master, it doesn't just steal your discipline, it rewrites your desires. You no longer want to grow. You just want relief. But relief is not peace. It is the anesthesia that keeps you comfortably dying. To Plato, the addict is not evil. He's lost. Not just lost in behavior, but in orientation. His soul no longer knows which way is up. He confuses stimulation with joy, escape with peace, craving with desire, and because the black horse pulls so violently, the charioteer inside him can no longer steer. So he crashes over and over again into guilt, shame, isolation, only to rise and repeat the cycle. But Plato knew, you can't reason with a soul enslaved by appetite. It has to suffer first. And that suffering is the very crack through which light can begin to re-enter. The worst part of addiction isn't the act. It's what it makes you forget. You forget the books you wanted to write, the strength you once promised yourself you'd build, the woman you were once capable of loving without turning her into an object. You forget how to be still, how to be clear, how to be alive without needing constant fire to feel anything. And Plato would say, the soul takes flight when it turns to what is eternal, but your soul hasn't flown in a long time, because it's chained to the next click, the next bite, the next high. You don't need more stimulation. You need to remember who you were before you needed it. Plato believed that every soul longs to ascend, to move from the visible to the invisible, from sensation to truth. But addiction traps you in the lowest layer of that journey, the world of appearances. You stare at a screen and call it connection. You chase dopamine and call it happiness. You binge and call it freedom. But what you're really doing is building walls around your own potential. You are not choosing. You are reacting. Not thinking, but responding like a puppet to a button. Plato would say you've become what he feared most, a man too distracted to be dangerous. That's the core tragedy. Addiction doesn't just rob you of strength, it robs you of meaning. Because true meaning requires tension, discipline, pursuit. But pleasure asks for none of that. It offers reward without effort. And when that becomes your new standard, everything noble becomes boring. Silence feels unbearable. Purpose feels abstract. Discipline feels cruel. And soon, you no longer chase what's good, you chase what's easy. Plato knew, the soul that craves ease cannot climb, and if you will not climb, then you will descend, not by force, but by default. In Plato's world, every human soul is a battlefield, not between good and evil, but between what feels good and what is good. And the addict is the one who has lost the ability to tell the difference. He doesn't choose what's right, he chooses what's easy. He no longer climbs toward truth, he crawls toward relief. And the more he does it, the more the soul forgets its shape. It begins to warp. It starts to crave what destroys it, until eventually it defends the very thing that's killing it. Plato saw this clearly. When desire becomes law, the soul becomes unrecognizable. That's why Plato believed education wasn't about information, it was about reorientation, turning the soul away from the shadows on the cave wall and back toward the light. But how do you turn a man whose eyes are addicted to flicker, whose emotions spike only when artificial pleasure is fed to him? You don't convince him, you shake him, you break the loop, you name the pattern. And then you ask, is this who you were meant to be? Because if your life is ruled by impulses, if you can't stop when you know you should, then you are not living. You are being lived by something else. The addict's tragedy is not that he's weak, but that he thinks his desires define him. He builds his identity around them. I'm just a man with needs. It's natural. Everyone does it. But Plato would call this the voice of the cave, the whispers of the shadows convincing you that the floor is the ceiling, that what you're chasing is light, when it's just a flicker painted on the wall. The man addicted to pleasure becomes a slave who wears his chains proudly. He's not ashamed. He's defended. But inside, something in him still knows. He used to be more. Plato's remedy was never punishment. It was remembrance. To remember what your soul once loved before it was hijacked by cravings. To remember the higher part of you that still longs for clarity, discipline, beauty, meaning. You don't heal addiction by hating yourself. You heal by returning, by confronting the parts of you that were silenced in the noise of constant gratification. You have to relearn stillness, relearn effort, relearn how to want something that takes time. Because Plato believed, Only the soul that resists the pull of pleasure can ascend to wisdom, and most men never even try. There's a moment in every addict's life when the pleasure stops working. It still comes, but it no longer satisfies. You feel empty even while consuming. And that is the soul's alarm. That is the sound Plato wanted you to hear, the quiet agony beneath the stimulation, because that is your proof that you're not just a body chasing highs. You are something more, something aware, something trying to break through the noise. Plato would call this the soul remembering its wings. And if you listen, if you stop running, you might hear it calling you back. Back to the tension, back to the mountain, back to the part of you that knows the easy path has nothing left to offer. You've tasted every shortcut, you've followed every impulse, and all it gave you was fatigue and a weaker will. But in that weakness, there is a doorway. The moment you admit the pleasure owns you, you can start to own yourself again. Plato never promised peace, he promised struggle. Struggle with yourself, with your shadows, with your appetites. But through that struggle, the soul begins to rise. Not because it has escaped pain, but because it has chosen something higher than relief. Freedom, to Plato, was not the absence of rules, but the presence of order. Internal order. A soul where reason governs desire, not the other way around. But modern men have reversed the hierarchy. Pleasure is king, reason is servant. And in that upside-down kingdom, discipline feels like prison, and indulgence feels like liberation. But it's a lie, a dangerous one, because the more you obey your impulses, the more they become your ruler. And Plato would say, no man is free who cannot say no to himself. The path out isn't glamorous. It's slow. It's silent. It doesn't feel like victory. It feels like withdrawal from your habits, from your illusions, from the part of you that thought pleasure was the point. But with every moment of restraint, the white horse, the noble part of your soul, gets stronger. Your will sharpens. Your clarity returns. And one day, without needing applause or perfection, you realize you've taken the reins back. Not forever, not flawlessly, but enough to turn the chariot toward the light again. That, to Plato, is where real manhood begins. You don't need to be perfect. You need to be aware, because awareness is the beginning of resistance, and resistance is the beginning of power. Every time you pause before the impulse, you weaken the black horse. Every time you sit in discomfort instead of escaping, you remind your soul that it still has a spine. Plato never said it would be easy. He said it would be worth it. Because the man who masters himself doesn't just escape addiction, he becomes dangerous again. Not to others, but to every lie that ever made him small. And suddenly, beauty starts to look different. Silence stops feeling like punishment. Depth becomes desirable again, because your soul, once numbed by constant noise, begins to feel again, begins to crave real things, hard things, meaningful things. And that's how you know the climb has begun. Not because you've arrived, but because you've stopped escaping. Plato would say, the soul that turns away from the shadows must be trained to look at the light. And that training, that return to what is higher, is not found in comfort. It's found in the quiet war you fight with yourself, and win, one moment at a time. This isn't just about porn, or food, or your phone. It's about what happens to a soul that forgets it was built to reach upward. A soul that settles, that trades greatness for comfort, that worships pleasure and calls it peace. Plato's darkest warning wasn't about what you consume. It was about what you become when you forget to aim higher. And in that forgetting, you don't just lose time. You lose identity, purpose, vision, until one day you're not a man anymore. You're just a reaction wearing a name. But if you're still listening, that means something in you hasn't died. Something in you still wants to fight. And Plato would tell you, then fight. Not by punishing yourself, not by hating your weakness, but by remembering your design. You are not made to be ruled by appetite. You are not built to crawl toward comfort. You are made to govern yourself. And every time you do, your soul takes a step out of the cave and toward the light. That light is not fame, or pleasure, or applause. That light is you, reborn through fire. So when the urge hits and the screen calls and the craving whispers, don't just resist. Remember. Remember that every time you say no, you are not depriving yourself. You are reclaiming yourself. You are choosing tension over sedation, meaning over numbness, ascent over decay. Plato would tell you, the path upward is narrow, steep, and painful, but it's the only path that leads to the soul's true home. And most men will never take it. But you? If you've seen the truth, you can't unsee it. You were not made to be entertained. You were not made to be satisfied. You were made to seek, to struggle, to climb, to remember. That is the work of the philosopher. That is the war of the soul. And in that war, every refusal to kneel before pleasure is an act of rebellion, a spark, a signal to the universe that your chariot has turned toward the light. And if Plato could speak into your modern world, he'd say this: you are not weak because you feel the pull. You are weak only when you forget you were meant to fly.